Hello and welcome to Trust Me, I'm a Philosopher. I'm Jonathan. I'm an academic philosopher working in the UK, working a lot on the philosophy of trust. And I am delighted to welcome back to the channel Sareh Pouryousefi. As those of you who've watched the first video will know, Sareh is an assistant professor here at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University. Sareh, thank you so much for being prepared to do a second run.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. And I should just say apologies if the sound here is a little bit funky. We are downtown Toronto. Fire truck has just gone past. There are people in the corridor. It's all very, very exciting. Lots going on. But please bear with us with the sound quality if that's any kind of an issue when you're watching this back. Today is a bit of a treat for me because Sareh and I have written together. We're continuing to write together on a range of different projects. And one of the really interesting things about co-authoring is you're not always in the final paper saying what you think about something, or you're saying what you agree with someone about. And so today Sareh and I are going to talk about a paper that we wrote together, and I get to find out what Sareh actually thinks about what's in the paper and why we wrote it and why it matters. So Sareh, first question for you, what was in the background to this paper? Why did we write it? Why would anyone bother doing anything like this?
So we wrote it because I think there's not a lot of attention paid to how we trust organizations or corporations specifically. So I think it's just a well-known fact that we go around our lives every day trusting corporations to do all kinds of things for us. From the way that we interact with them as consumers, from the way that we interact with them as employees, or just in our day-to-day activities buying things from them. We take it for granted that somehow our interests can be served in certain ways, and yet often they're not. Often our trust is betrayed. So we seem to have this way of ordinarily thinking about how we relate to corporations, but when it comes to theoretical thinking about trust, much of the attention in philosophy has been elsewhere, specifically on trust between individuals. And so why is that, and what do we make of that?
Cool. So on the trusting corporations side of things then, presumably something like me trusting Apple when I spend my ill-gotten gains on an iPhone or something. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And so, well then, I mean, what did we find, Sareh, in the paper?
So we found that most of the time when philosophers talk about trust, they talk about particularized trust. So this is when it's a three-place relationship when one person, say X, trusts another person Y to do something in particular Y, so some particular action. So I trust you to show up to a meeting on time when we said we would meet at a certain time, for example. And that kind of three-place relationship happens between particular individuals. Whereas in relation to corporations, that only takes us so far. Often these are institutional, there are institutional structures and processes and rules and policies that govern a whole bunch of different individuals in corporations, and they relate to each other in different ways following certain norms, but also sometimes in ways that transcend a particular individual. So it seems like we should be able to somehow talk about how it is that we relate to a corporation when we trust them. But what we found is that actually using what we talk about in terms of trust and philosophy and the morally relevant relationships in trust and philosophy, that there is no such way to really relate to a corporation other than to the individuals within the corporation. So there is no such account of corporations as one that is related to that level of morally relevant trust.
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, to come back to the example of Apple, if I buy an iPhone or I buy any other sort of phone from any other sort of a company, it's not the case that I'm trusting Tim Cook to do something. Rather, I'm trusting the corporation itself to do something, and that's distinct from a trust in person. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing.
That kind of thing, and that when we in philosophy when we trust other individuals, there's kind of often we talk about certain reactive attitudes we might have towards them. So we might blame them if they don't live up to our expectations, for example, or we might feel anger towards them. And then the individual who we trusted might appropriately feel certain reactive attitudes, like they might feel regret. When they're going to apologize, they should show appropriate remorse, for example. But those kinds of reactive attitudes is where things become complicated for corporations, because what we need is an account of exactly how corporations can be both appropriate targets of reactive attitudes and appropriate sources of reactive attitudes in order for us to be able to meaningfully talk about trusting them in a morally relevant way.
Yeah, cool. So again, to come back to Apple, and I don't have any particular vested interest in talking about Apple, they're just a nice, easy, familiar company to talk about. I mean, it's one thing for me to say, blame Tim Cook. He is a person, he is a moral agent. It's another thing to blame Apple, right? Because presumably Apple isn't necessarily a moral agent in quite the same way that we might think of Tim Cook as being. And particularly that source of response that you were talking about, right? How does Apple itself as an entity get to feel guilt? That feels like a very strange kind of a question to be asking. Yeah, cool. We're on the same page still in describing the paper.
I think so.
Excellent,
So
excellent.
far.
Always very reassuring to find after you've published a paper that you in fact agree with your co-author on some things. Cool, thank you, Sarah. So, I mean, if that's what we found, and I think we're both in agreement that that was what was in the paper, why do you think any of this matters? Does any of it matter?
Well, it matters because philosophers are quite interested and concerned about whether or not corporations can be appropriately talked about as if they have moral agency. And we don't often, there isn't kind of a standard off-the-shelf account of corporations as these kinds of moral agents that we can appropriately target for our reactive attitudes, or that can serve as sources of reactive attitudes. So this matters because we want to be able to make sense of ordinary language. Here's some Toronto traffic.
I know, it's really enlivening the mood, it's all good, yeah.
So given that we might talk or think about trust in corporations like Apple, it would help to be able to make sense of it using philosophical theory. And yet, if all we're doing is using approaches that we have to trust, we kind of run up against the wall where without an appropriate account of corporate agency, there's not much to say other than we're just speaking wrong. We shouldn't be talking about trusting Apple. We should be talking about having confidence in Apple. We should be talking about relying on Apple. We should just not be talking about trusting Apple.
Yeah, cool. So I'm really tempted to ask you a bunch of different follow-up questions off the back of that. But one thing that you touched on that I think might be really interesting to some folks who are watching was that you said that we don't normally think of corporations as being the subject of moral discourse properly, but we do think of them being the subject of legal discourse in lots of different ways. It seems there then like you're drawing a distinction between the moral and the legal. What do you think, very, very roughly, I'm not asking you for half an hour on the subject, but what roughly do you think that distinction might come to?
I think it's really important to get that distinction right. I actually happen to be employed at a law and business department, and so when I discuss this kind of research with my legal colleagues, I have to go through very distinct kind of song and dance to make sure they don't get excited, because I'm not talking about the law. There is a very separate discourse, much more advanced, in my opinion, than the philosophical discourse on these questions about moral agency in groups in law. And so most bodies of law, as I understand them, have an account of corporate agency that does not reduce to particular individuals, in fact. And I think that is very promising. That is one practical applied venue where we can try to understand how people who are suing corporations might relate to corporations and their sense of corporate agency, and then from that try to understand what we can say about what philosophers should be able to talk about when we talk about trusting corporations.
Fantastic, thank you. So you've talked there about the sort of thing that might come next, I guess, the sort of promising avenues for further work. What do you think we should do next, Sarah? What should be the project that follows on from this work?
Let me think. There's lots of things we could be doing. There's the thing about the professions, where we can think about what exactly we mean, because corporations are of course, there's a a very large number of different kinds of organizational settings that fit under the definition of a corporation, and professional associations are just one of them, very important one of them. So there's kind of a case study of this, I guess, when we think about a particular instance of thinking about what trust is in relation to corporations, when we think about the professions. So that's one place. And then I think a really interesting thing to do is just to try to understand what exists in terms of experimental and empirical data on the way that people do relate to corporations. So I already, in other work that we're doing, I'm finding that people are quite angry. They're very open to showing their anger, consumers, in various social media venues and groups and online formats, showing their expressions of anger towards corporations. But they're also expressions of love. And so what do we make of all of that? Is everyone just very confused? And should people just kind of en masse update their linguistic use of the word trust? Or is it that philosophers need to stop being so bossy about the way we use certain terms?
I think that the philosophers should never stop being bossy. Philosophers rule the world, or should rule the world, is clearly the right answer from this channel. So, Sareh, that's been really, really fantastic. Thank you so much. Great to have the opportunity to talk to you about our paper. I hope you've enjoyed this, and as well as enjoying the conversation with Sareh, that you've enjoyed Toronto's downtown traffic. Clearly, drivers not trusting one another to behave quite as we might wish, but I know that I can trust you to like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back soon with some more thinking about trust, what it is, how we can build it, and why all of that matters.
You are not allowed to stop on Dundas Street, but everyone always stops on Dundas Street.
That's so going in.
And so every once in a while, when people are from out of town and they find themselves on Dundas Street, they lose their mind.